morning and welcome to Rising. We've got a great show for you today. I'm joined by Amber and Nomiki. Love to see you both get into the news.
How you doing?
Let's do it.
All right. Trump and Vice President Harris are locked in a dead heat with just 2 weeks before Election Day. According to U.S. Today, Suffolk University polling that Harris is up 45% to 44%. Emerson College says that she is also leading 49 to 48%. But Fox News polling shows Trump has regained the lead with 50% to 48%. He's also gained ground in the swing states, so much so that pollster Nate Silver now rates the chances of a Trump win as slightly more likely than a Harris win, 52% to 47%. But clearly, this is anyone's game. Now, early voting is already underway. Nearly every state in the country offers some form of early voting. More than 15 million Americans have already cast their ballots in the 2024 election. Polls opened in Florida and Texas on Monday, while key swing states like Georgia and Nevada opened their polling booths last week. 1 million people in North Carolina have hit the polls, and already Georgia has broken its early turnout record with 1.4 million ballots cast.
According to Vote Tracker, on early and mail-in voting conducted by University of Florida, 48.1% of Democrats have voted, while 31.8% of Republicans and 20.1% of non-affiliated have voted. These results are based on data available from 23 states, including key states Pennsylvania, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, and North Carolina.
While Democrats have a clear edge on early voting so far, Republicans have embraced the practice of hitting the polls before Election Day, which is eating into the Democrats' advantage. Despite former President Donald Trump sending mixed signals on the issue, more Republicans are turning out early this cycle than in prior years. 31% of GOP voters have turned in ballots this cycle, compared to 24% in 2020. And in some of these key swing states, Republicans are outpacing Democrats on the early voting metrics. In Nevada, Clark County specifically, Republicans are outpacing Democrats by a 2-to-1 margin. In Virginia, the counties that went for Trump in 2020 have been returning early ballots at a higher rate than some of the blue counties. So whatever the RNC has done since 2020 to encourage early voting and mail-in voting appears to be working.
Yeah, if I was the Democrats, I'd be a little bit worried right now. The trends are going Trump's way. As I mentioned, Nate Silver now has him up just very slightly. Those swing state polls have gotten very, 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 very close, but with Trump a little bit ahead, and that's where it's going to matter. And, of course, we have to remember that the polling error last time was so dramatically in Democrats' favor that I feel like if the polling shows that it's close, it could actually be Trump very far ahead.
I don't look at 2020 for any sort of methodology, and I don't think I think it's malfeasance for anybody in political.
I think because of the COVID.
Because of COVID. It was just the numbers were so irregular, there was no way to truly have an accurate sense, especially with all the new mail-in voting and in a lot of states early voting for the first time. What I do find also malfeasance is for folks to be reporting on early voting numbers. Have we learned anything from previous elections when the pollsters are doing exit polling, knowing that it's flawed, especially when it's so close? But and early voting is something that can influence the outcome, right? When you start pushing those, it could go in either favor, by the way. It could hit Democrats might be more motivated now seeing these numbers come in for Trump and the pace, or vice versa. What is interesting to me, though, and as an indication, is that in Michigan and North Carolina, the RNC, the Republican parties in those states, pushed to challenge overseas voting, whether it was veterans or overseas voters who have the right, if you're an American citizen, to vote. And both courts, appointees, Republican, struck it down. And in Michigan, the judge was pretty clear. He said this baseless lawsuit targeted the voting rights of U.S. citizens and their families living abroad, including the children of active duty service members. It represents a new low in the ongoing PR campaign to cast doubt on the security of Michigan's election. That came from the judge. That was not a partisan response. That was something saying, you're desperate. You can't be pushing these things in the last minute.
Well, we do know in the terms of the early vote numbers, those are not based on exit polls. Those are based on required reports that come from the secretaries of state on a daily basis. So I guess your suggestion that these are influencing outcomes of the election, would you support some kind of law to require secretaries of state not provide people that information?
No, I think it's journalistic, just like you're allowed to have an exit poll, but journalists
But it's public information.
I mean, it's Republicans who would want the election just to take place on election day, right? No early voting, just you got to show up in the day on person and vote, and if you don't, you don't.
Sure.
You're saying it, early voting is going to influence stuff.
No,
I think Republicans would be like, your terms are acceptable.
Right. I said it could go either way. But what I'm saying is that as journalists and reporters and commentators, it's just a little malfeasance because we don't have, it's not an accurate number, and of course it can influence.
How is it not accurate?
Because it's not the final result. Every day it changes, and the reports come out every day, but it just means that, we have to be a little bit more careful in letting the public understand this is not the full number, numbers change every day. It's like...
I think people are smart enough to know that.
Another number I saw this morning that was worth bringing up, Arab Americans specifically, there was a poll showing Donald Trump ahead of Kamala Harris with this group specifically. I mean, it's close, like 45 to 43%. And even in the poll, they asked about the voters' views on Israel-Gaza, and they trusted Trump more to resolve this problem than Harris. This is the kind of thing, that if this costs thousands of votes in Michigan, that could decide the election.
There were also some reports coming out of people who were getting text messages from phone bankers for Kamala Harris who expressed that they weren't going to support her or volunteer for her because of her position on the Israel-Gaza conflict. And the phone bankers were actually arguing back with them and getting incredibly snarky, which I think is like pretty much, phone banking 101 is that you probably shouldn't condescend to the person.
We don't want your vote!
Right?
I got a phone call the other night, and it was from Arizona. Now, I have not voted. I mean, I was 18 or 21, I think, when I was in college last time I voted, or 22, something like that. And they called me up, and I'm like, you're really digging through. Like, can you clean out your voting rolls? I vote in New York, and I have voted in New York, and that's my registration. But I think that these voting rolls really need to be cleaned out because this happens all the time, every election, where you're getting phone calls. I'm sure you get them from Michigan.
I have a Michigan cell phone number.
Yep.
I get probably 50 texts a day. Telling me about Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Yes, it's very annoying. Nice. I cannot vote in the state of Michigan.
But it just shows you
stop
how important this election is to both parties. They are going through like the least likely voters. Triple prime are the most likely voters. So I never get calls in New York because they're like, well, we know you're going to show up and vote Democrat or vote progressive in that case. But for Arizona to be going through and saying, well, that person they're Democrat, they haven't voted in 20-something years, I'm going to give them a call. But they were so nice on the phone. And I said, just keep doing what you're doing. And then the guy was like, I live in Brooklyn. I know who you are. So I was like, oh, that's weird. Okay.
Well, coming up next on Rising, what happened to a reporter who allegedly got a little too close to a major presidential candidate? We'll be talking about that. It's coming up next on Rising. Olivia Nuzzi is out at New York Magazine. The outlet announced on Monday it had decided to part ways with its star Washington correspondent. It was revealed last month that she had allegedly had a personal relationship with presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Nuzzi was a media darling until she started writing critical articles about President Biden's mental capacity, long before most in the mainstream media were willing to acknowledge the president's shortcomings. Her dalliance with RFK Jr. became fodder for tabloids and media critics alike. Even though she was cleared of breaching any ethical lapses in terms of her coverage by a white shoe law firm, she was still shown the door at New York Magazine. New York Magazine acknowledged that no inaccuracies or evidence of bias was found in Nuzzi's coverage of RFK. But they, quote, agreed that the best course forward is to part ways. Nuzzi is a uniquely talented writer, and we have been proud to publish her work over her nearly 8 years as our Washington correspondent. We wish her the best.
Vox Media, which owns the magazine, put Nuzzi on leave last month. At the same time, Ryan Lizza, a star political reporter decades her senior, announced that his engagement to Nuzzi was over. She has been dragged through the mud personally and professionally. So the question, has there been a double standard? I think both of you know where I stand on this. It's one thing to break journalistic standards, which is why she was put on leave. It's another thing to be let go. Obviously, we don't know what happened internally. Ryan Lizza was on leave, and he started to report, and then he went on full leave. We've seen other people go through this before. including folks on CNN who had shown themselves on camera in really inappropriate ways and then went right back into reporting at CNN. A lot of folks are forgiven, men, I could name several men, and I think that the way that there was a barrage of criticism towards her, she made a mistake. She's not in a relationship with RFK anymore. It damaged her personal relationship. I'm not saying it was right what she did, but I don't think that she deserves to be fired.
Yeah, well, I think it's hard to tell because we don't know. I mean, RFK Jr. has denied that this was an actual relationship, so I don't know how involved it actually was, how outside the bounds of normal professional conduct hers was. Again, I'm not big into cancel culture or like ruining people's lives over lapses of this kind, and she wasn't specifically covering him or writing about him when this supposedly happened. So I think I agree with you. I'm not sure it's a double standard. It's such an odd situation that I don't know that it was also wrong to part ways for her, and it might have been mutual. She might just not feel like she could do her job there anymore. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, I think that she was totally out of bounds. I mean, it is basically journalistic principle 101 that you do not sleep with your sources.
She didn't.
Have inappropriate romantic relationships with your sources. She did a profile on RFK Jr. She met him during the course of this profile, then proceeded to have some kind of inappropriate relationship. Obviously, there's different ideas of what actually happened here. RFK claims that she was obsessing over him and basically stalking him to an extent, whereas Nuzzi allegedly
That's in some ways worse.
Right, and then Ryan Lizza claims that Nuzzi told him that RFK was texting her that he wanted to impregnate her, that she was his, and all kinds of other sick, twisted things between these two. I think, bar none, if you take one side or the other, both are inappropriate for a reporter to be involved in. I have a pretty good feeling that any woman I know in conservative media, if they had done this, they would have been shown the door as well and would have been fired. And I don't think that this is an overreaction at all.
It is possible. She did make people so mad in Democratic circles and media circles after her reporting on Biden's cognitive problems. The fury from Blue Anon was insane. So I do wonder if there was less of a desire, because there's always some discretion by these media outlets, right? Like you said, they brought back Tubin after a period of time. I mean, he was off for a while.
Yeah.
Sure. But so they always can decide, suspension, and then, because people move on, like nobody's going to remember this story.
Well, and that's the thing.
So they could have said, all right, whatever, and maybe they didn't because she had so made pro-Harris, pro-Biden people mad with honest coverage of the
probably would have had more defenders if she had not written that article about Biden's cognitive
100%.
I think that's 100% true. I will also say that it is very typical in media that this happens, somebody gets quote-unquote canceled, and then a year later they're back at some primetime outlet in basically the same position that they were before. If I were her, I wouldn't be too worried about my career because it's sort of inevitable that these things come full circle. Mm-hmm. No one stays out of media for long.
I don't agree with you. I think that there's plenty of women who've been, there's definitely a gender thing happening here. You quoted two people, RFK and Ryan Lizza, but you didn't quote Olivia Nuzzi, who has not spoken out yet, and her. I mean, that's partially.
Why I can't quote her.
Well, that's partially legal strategy, and I think it's RFK's legal strategy too. There were conversations about whether or not he was acting out of bounds with her.
But he doesn't have any legal liability here because he's not the one who behaved in an unethical manner related to his profession.
Well,
sure,
he was
cheating on
married
your wife
and he might
is
be
awful.
going through a divorce. I mean, there's so many factors here. If you're going through a divorce, as anybody who's watching
no one's filed
has
for
probably
divorce.
gone through a divorce, but they might be.
She's actually in the middle of a legal challenge against her employer, right?
But Amber, people's lives, they prepare for divorces, and there's lots of divorce strategies in terms of, getting ahead of a story, just like Ryan Lizza also got ahead of a story. Olivia Nuzzi was trying to keep her job, as far as we understand, during this period, and she has not spoken out. And meanwhile, the wrath that she received online was also on the right, because I posted one thing saying, hey guys, maybe exercise the same feminism towards people that don't agree with you as much as people who do agree with you. And I got the right wing, the RFK people coming at me, and then I got the left, And then they were saying things like, you're removing her of her agency. And it's like, no, I'm actually discussing how you're not treating her the same way you are RFK and Ryan Liz. I mean, they were using horrible language, gendered language, the CUNT word, and other things as well, the W word that we know. And I'm sorry, it's just, have you never received the wrath of sexism online and the thousands of tweets? One time, just me, and I know other women in media deal with this all the time, I put my phone on record for 10 minutes. It just kept coming through on my Twitter page. So it is something that is a little bit different. Jeffrey Toobin did not experience that.
There's no way that's true.
There's still a verb. We still say Toobin as a verb.
But he didn't get the hate, like, I'm going to come and kill you. And
no, that's not true. I mean, I've gotten death threats. It has to, like, you go a long while without getting it, and then someone we all know how this works. Someone prominent shares a tweet of yours or a clip from this show, and then you get a pile on. It's certainly the case that prominent people have to endure, very nasty responses. So I don't actually think
there are studies at this point where there is an outsized proportion of
there's
women
studies showing
in public.
There's studies showing the opposite of that there is no difference between the level of harassment men and women
between men and women online.
No, it's just
women undeniably receive more harassment. The algorithm is geared towards
utterly.
men. The YouTube algorithm for politics is almost majority male. I mean, of course there's a difference. And those are published reports. That's what YouTube puts
Maybe women
forward.
are just bad at YouTube.
What do you mean? They're not watching. Yeah. I mean, our audience skews male. There's more male people watching our audience.
That's what most YouTube shows, political shows, and that has to do with the algorithm shifting. And there's lots of factors at play here. But YouTube's been open about that. And YouTube even fired the woman who released that algorithm, Timrit. She was the one who went in there and said, I was hired to assess the algorithm and whether it's gendered or racist. She came forward, issued the report, and then she was fired. And then she sued Google as a result. This is just, at this point, it's ridiculous to say that these places aren't biased against women and people of color.
I don't think they're biased against women.
Well, you're not seeing that on your...
I disagree. As a woman online, I see all kinds of harassment against people who are public figures. I think that just comes with being...
You're getting harassment because you're spicy.
Yeah.
That's why you're getting harassment. That's why I'm getting harassment. That's why you're getting harassment.
And the UN issued a statement. Organization for American Studies, Canadian Women's Foundation, Standing Committee on the Status of Women, Statistics Canada. This is specifically, I guess, a Canadian section right here.
All organizations that profit off of making people believe that there's bias against women.
Is this a conspiracy now?
Maybe.
Okay.
If you're a nonprofit organization and you see donations based on whether or not people think women are being marginalized in the United States of America in 2024...
what about Google? Google makes money off of this.
I'm turning toward...
International Center for Journalists. How about that? They don't focus on women.
So we ran... the magazine I write for, Reason, ran a great piece by the journalist Kathy Young, who's somewhat on the right, although is intensely anti-Trump, writes for The Bulwark, and she had a really good... So this is not some biased, wildly right-wing pro-Trump person. She had a good analysis of the evidence at the time that showed, surprisingly, it was harder to actually find concrete evidence of more online harassment being directed at women. So I don't have time here to go into that more deeply, but that's where I was getting my perspective on this from. She's a pretty fair adjudicator of this subject.
All of this is just a distraction from the fact that Olivia Nuzzi behaved unethically. I'm sorry that things are hard for her right now, but...
Should she be fired for it, though?
Yeah.
You said the wrong thing on air, or if you met, for instance, if you interviewed somebody, was your guest, and then 3 weeks later...
I started sexting them? Yeah, I should be fired.
You don't know. There's no evidence of this. They had an outside law firm come in and assess it. This is all based on...
they found some evidence.
RFK...
The outside law firm, though, did not exonerate her from having an inappropriate relationship with RFK. It said that it didn't affect her coverage. They couldn't find any evidence that it had biased her coverage. That doesn't mean that she's absolved or exonerated from having the inappropriate relationship. It doesn't matter if it impacts your coverage or not. Just engaging in it gives the perception to people who are reading your work that you're biased, and that's unethical. It's against journalistic ethics.
So let me ask you this. If you interviewed somebody 5 years ago, and then 5 years later they're texting you, right?
This is not an analogous situation.
It is. They started texting afterwards, and there's no evidence that they had a sexual relationship. It's been denied. Even her magazine, New York Magazine, said the same thing, right? So I understand that you have your own values. And there's journalism ethics, there's your values, and then there's the law. And you cannot be fired for that. And so that's why I think they came to agreement. So there's a double standard in that, sure, she did not violate the terms of New York Magazine. The outside law firm stated that. So clearly she wasn't fired for having an affair.
Well, you don't know
because
that.
If that's the case,
we honestly don't even know that she was fired because
Right.
That's
they
what I'm
could
saying.
have
That's
both
what I'm
just
saying.
decided this is not. This is
saying.
not
But
gonna
She
work.
also could be an
Violate.
at-will
Could be an
employee,
at-will employee.
in which
yeah.
case they can fire her for any reason.
I
they
think
want.
they should be able to fire you for whatever reason if they think this is not working out anymore.
You think?
Nobody has a right to work for a magazine.
Well, you could if you're on salary.
Yeah, I mean, if they
I'm pretty
don't
sure it's
if they don't want to pay you anymore because they don't think you're good for the organization, they should be able to do that. We've got a lot more to talk about today on Rising. Stay tuned. More of the show coming up.
It's a case that puts a spotlight on the nation's debate over racial injustice and crime and the safety of New York City's subway. The trial for the man accused of choking a man to death on a New York City subway has begun. You may remember back in May of 2023, there was a widely shared video of a former Marine, Daniel Penny, wrapping his arms around a man's neck, restraining him in a chokehold until he died.
Now that former Marine, who was discharged in 2021, faces charges of manslaughter for the death of Jordan Neely. Penny has pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argue that Penny did not apply enough pressure for the hold to be deadly, while on the other side, prosecutors argue he used excessive force to kill Neely. Neely was 30 years old and worked as a Michael Jackson impersonator. Witnesses said that Neely struggled with drug addiction, mental illness, and homelessness, and had numerous criminal run-ins with the law, had been shouting, throwing things, and acting erratically on the subway train in Manhattan when Penny approached him.
With the help of two other passengers, Penny pinned Neely to the ground and placed him in a chokehold for over 6 minutes until Neely lost consciousness. Witnesses have been mixed as to whether or not they felt personally threatened by Neely, with some saying they were just used to that sort of erratic behavior on the NYC subway. None of the witnesses claim Neely had a weapon or that he came into physical contact with anyone before Penny approached him.
Neely's death sparked nearly 2 weeks of protests before Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg's office brought an indictment.
All the while, millions of dollars in donation poured in from across the country to help Penny cover his legal costs, including from former presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, and former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. That's all sides of the GOP. They've been showing their support for Penny. The New York City Chief Medical Examiner's officer found that Neely died from compression to his neck as a result of the chokehold. The medical examiner's toxicology report found synthetic cannabinoids were in Neely's system when he died.
Jury selection began Monday and is expected to last 6 weeks. If convicted, Penny faces a maximum of 15 years in prison.
So this is a divisive, debating topic. Obviously, I am conflicted on this one because I do think the level of crime and erratic bad behavior on the New York City subway system I know is an issue, or just the streets of New York City. And this is someone who had been had 42 prior involvements with law enforcement, including for assaulting 3 different women over a string of time. This was a dangerous, disturbed individual, and I don't, if police are unwilling to take action against these kinds of things to actually keep the streets safe, you're going to have citizens taking matters into their own hands. Now, he choked Jordan Neely for a long period of time, and it did result in his death. And you can't just, in my view, you can't just kill someone on the subway because they're acting funny or crazy or something like that. So that's I'm in the middle. I see why people are acting out to counter this kind of thing. I think this kind of thing is totally unacceptable. This clearly was a dangerous person, but I don't know that the actions taken fit the circumstance. Because
someone has mental illness, because somebody acts erratic, because somebody has a record does not mean, as you said, they should be killed by anybody, including the police. They have to try 2 things right now. It's second-degree manslaughter, which means reckless intent. That's the more difficult thing to try. And then criminally negligent homicide, which is the lower burden of proof. The burden that he has right now is he's a former Marine. And he has trained, and this is a Marine expert saying, he was trained, a trainer, to know the degrees of a chokehold and when a chokehold is lethal. And he sat there for 6 minutes holding this man in a chokehold while somebody else assisted him and while the subway car was screaming at him. As a New Yorker, we are very, very used to people coming on the subway and singing and dancing and sometimes yelling, sometimes acting inappropriately. But I think with the jury, as a jury of New Yorkers, probably from all spectrum, are probably going to sit there and say, you know, this man knew what he was doing, he had an intent, maybe he won't be tried on both, but he'll most likely probably be convicted on one. And it's going to be really difficult for, I think, any New Yorker to say it's worth just killing a guy. And, you know, that's why so many New Yorkers got up in arms about this.
It is certainly sad that you all are just living under the expectation that people are going to harass you and yell at you and behave erratically on the subway. That shouldn't be the norm of living in any city. And I think Daniel Penny is a hero because according to the passengers' testimony of what they witnessed on that train, he wasn't just being weird and behaving erratically, he was actively threatening the people on that subway. And Daniel Penny was the only person who was willing to stand up for them when their police had abandoned them, when their city had abandoned them. He was willing to take action and make sure the people on that train were safe. There was an African-American woman who actually came out and said that she was grateful for Daniel Penny because it was the only time that she felt like somebody was standing up for her and making sure that she was safe while riding the subway. There was another African-American man who assisted Daniel Penny in restraining Jordan Neely, who was not charged with a crime. So, I mean, maybe you could argue that he applied the chokehold too forcefully. Maybe he had adrenaline and didn't realize what he was doing. He held him for 6 minutes because he was waiting for the police to come, because unfortunately that's how long it takes apparently in a New York City subway for police to come to an incident of this nature. And when he realized that Jordan Neely had stopped breathing, he immediately provided medical attention and tried to give CPR to make sure that his life was saved. He was not intending to kill Jordan Neely. He was trying to protect his fellow passengers.
Well, the lawyers are going to have a big burden of proof regardless, as usual, to prove that somebody willfully with intent was planning to kill. But again, he still killed him. And he was a Marine who was trained in this. This wasn't just your average Joe trying to hold down, not knowing it was a chokehold. This was somebody who knows how to kill people. He was a Marine. And, you know, while you mentioned a few people, there were several people that were witnesses that are going to be brought before. They've already, the attorneys have already stated that they're going to bring before witnesses on the train that were the opposite.
It's
so
actually
it happen
hard.
On both sides.
It's harder than people think from watching TV and movies to engage in the right level of force to not harm. I mean, you can punch someone in the face and kill them.
Yeah.
You can, you know, we're used to watching TV fights and everything where people beat the crap out of each other and they're fine. Or I love when I hear that, you know, why don't the police ever, or whoever, you know, shoot to wound?
Shoot
you can't shoot to wound. You can't do that. They only shoot to kill, because you can't, unless you're like Jack Bauer, you don't have that level of, even professionally trained people don't have that level of accuracy. So they're always shooting. They're shooting to stop the person from moving or resisting. You don't shoot in the leg, and also you can kill someone from shooting them in the leg. So the idea that he could, you know, if you engage someone physically in this way, there's always some risk, particularly if the person is mentally ill or has drugs in their system or has other things, that it goes wrong. Now, but you know, to your point again, why I am conflicted on this, right? No one on the subway was harmed except Jordan Neely. I understand trying to resist it, but he did die as a result of the actions taken by Daniel Penny. And you know, we all can say that yes, the subway shouldn't be like this, and people shouldn't have to put up with mentally ill people getting in their, which I totally agree with you on. But that doesn't mean you can just kill someone, because it doesn't seem like the right, an appropriate level of response to what the situation was at that time.
And he, again, was trained. So this wasn't your average Joe just acting out and punching. This
but again, even with training, you can.
Well, he knew how to do a chokehold, and the trainer said that a chokehold is very hard. I mean, it's a fine line in a chokehold between death and not death, and he knew that going in. That's the crazy thing about this testimony that they're going to bring forward. I mean,
like this got compared to George Floyd a lot, and that what was so bad in that situation is that it was the police themselves. Exactly. They're sitting on him, and they have handcuffs. They have a police car right there. Right. They could easily. He was no longer any kind of threat to get away from them, and they could have just stopped doing that and put him in the car.
He was selling,
and so that was a big screw up in that case that resulted in his death. This is a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I worry about the precedent that this could set. If the idea is that You protect your fellow passengers from someone who is actively threatening your life by restraining them, and unfortunately the restraint that you use either is held too long or you cross over that very thin line, as you put it, of applying too much force where you do cut off the airway. Does this say to people, if I defend myself or defend my fellow citizens, I'm going to go to jail for the rest of my life or for 10, 15 years because I was trying to keep people safe? That's
not his job. You can defend yourself.
But it is, everyone has a right to self-defense. So it actually is his job.
And you can defend other people.
Yes, exactly.
You don't have to just the right to defend.
They're not using that defense, which is actually very revealing. That is not the defense that his attorneys are planning to use. So if it were self-defense, that would be one way. But they're not using that. And just to your last point here, the police are everywhere on the subway. As a New Yorker,
not if it took them 6 minutes to get there.
They were moving on the subway,
right?
So you can't.
So they weren't on there.
They might have been in a different car, but Amber, you're looking at sometimes you're on a moving car. If you got in a car accident and the police weren't there right away, yet they were on the corner, does that mean that the police aren't?
Also, sometimes they just don't do anything. If
exactly.
They are approximate. I mean, this hasn't been a major.
I mean, you're proving my point by saying, well, the police are everywhere, but they weren't there on that car that day with Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely. And there were other passengers who were grateful that he acted and that he kept them safe.
A couple passengers who are going to be brought before to testify. And the majority, on the other hand, did not say that. Wow. And so I want to say that as a New Yorker, we care about our most vulnerable members in the community, and it's always people from outside of New York who are putting their beliefs on us.
Well, yeah, because y'all have been brainwashed into thinking violence is normal.
And it's not just people.
Violence is normal. It's the safest city in America. And it's getting safer. Over the last 2 years, it's only gotten safer.
That's not what the FBI said.
The FBI said that, yes, this year.
They just revised their statistics.
They did revise the statistics.
Violent crime or petty crime? That's what I'd like to know.
Violent crime.
Murder?
Yeah, violent crime is up in pretty much every American city, according to the FBI revised statistics.
All right, we have to leave it there. Coming up next, we've got another New York-centric story. The Central Park Five are suing Donald Trump. Stay tuned for more Rising.
We are 2 weeks out from Election Day, and former President Donald Trump was just slapped with another lawsuit. The Central Park Five are suing Donald Trump for defamation. The group is accusing the former president of making false and defamatory statements about them during last month's presidential debate with Vice President Harris in front of 67 million people. The group wrote, quote, "Trump falsely stated that plaintiffs killed an individual and pled guilty to the crime. These statements are demonstrably false." But of course, the history between Trump and the Central Park Five goes all the way back to 1989, when 5 teenagers who were Black and Latino were accused of the 1989 rape and beating of a white woman jogger in Central Park. The 5 said they confessed to the crime under duress. They later recanted, but were convicted after jury trials. After the crime, Trump purchased a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for a reinstatement to the death penalty. It was Trump's first foray into tough-on-crime politics. The Central Park Five's convictions were vacated in 2002 after another person confessed to the crime.
Here's the clip the Central Park Five are suing over. Let's watch.
Going back many, many years, when a lot of people, including Mayor Bloomberg, agreed with me on the Central Park Five, they said they pled guilty. And I said, well, if they pled guilty, they badly hurt a person, killed a person ultimately. And if they pled guilty, then they pled, we're not guilty.
The problem was no victim died, and Trump conflated confessions with guilty pleas.
A Trump spokesman called the suit, quote, just another frivolous election interference lawsuit filed by desperate left-wing activists in an attempt to distract the American people from Kamala Harris's dangerously liberal agenda and failing campaign. Meanwhile, one of the 5, New York City Council member Yusuf Salaam, shared his thoughts on CNN. Let's watch.
What's it like to see him doing what he's doing now 35 years later?
You know, when I think about a person like Donald Trump who is using his power to influence judgment, you know, I follow a faith as a Muslim that tells us that we shouldn't use our power to influence judgment. And here it is, 35 years ago for me, 1989, what he did by placing that ad in New York City's newspapers had a domino effect where people, the way I describe it really is that it was a whisper into the darkest enclaves of society for them to do to us what they had done to Emmett Till.
What do you think, Amber?
Well, I can tell you the people on this panel aren't going to like what I have to say about this. I'm in agreement with Donald Trump on the Central Park Five.
You think they're guilty?
I do, 100%.
Based on what?
based on the fact that all 5 of them separately admitted to having involvement in the beating and rape of this woman, and many of the details that they testified to in these meetings with police officers were confirmed by the evidence that was later collected at the scene. There were dozens of other witnesses in Central Park that day who all fingered these guys as having involvement. And we say in the opening read that they were exonerated by DNA evidence, but that's not exactly what happened. What happened was the prosecutors in this case actually always knew that there was another perpetrator that they had not caught, and this was brought up during the jury trial. And so when Mr. Reyes came forward and said that he was the one who actually raped the woman, the others should not have been exonerated as having beaten her, helped to hold her down. Some of them had actually admitted to the fact that they were masturbating or trying to get hard while they were watching what was happening to this woman. So the DNA evidence was taken from the woman's cervix and proved that Reyes was the one who actually penetrated her and ejaculated in her, but there was no indication that they should have been exonerated because nothing related to the DNA evidence proved that they weren't there.
I mean, one of them was convicted of murder, and the others were convicted of rape, so given that neither
right,
of
and
them
that's why the convictions had to be vacated, because the DNA evidence exonerated them from the rape and murder.
Yeah, so
but they were absolutely involved in the beating, in the sexual assault.
So my view is, from looking at the case, is I have questions about whether they were involved in that aspect. Now, that night, there was a whole group of people going through Central Park. There were a number of violent actions that took place. There was a bicyclist who got really badly beat up. That film that came out recently on Netflix really made light of the other crimes that were engaged.
Salam admitted to having the lead pipe that was used to hit both the cyclist and the jogger.
Their denials of the involvement with that kind of stuff came much later, and I find less believable. I do think there are enough serious questions about their involvement in the joggers' altercation to have them be released from prison and all of that kind of thing, because the guy who did have the actual semen was found had a history of operating as a lone wolf. I'm not sure I'm persuaded that they were involved. Their confessions, they were separated, they were young. That the film does portray that part where, if the police interrogate you for 10 hours, people do confess to things they didn't do because it's a, psychologically disturbing kind of ordeal to go through. So I am not, so I would not claim that they were guilty in the central aspect of the thing. I think some of the other details of that night are often not told in the media imagining where they are more likely to have been involved.
Not to mention, these were men of color in a time when the city was so afraid of anything, and that's why the media's handling of this and the police, who have a history of this in New York City, of targeting young black men, and I mean, whether it was stop and frisk much later, or in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with the crime rates. I mean, these were men who could not afford, boys who could not afford proper representation. And so if you're sitting there separated and you're a teenager, you're separated from the other guys, and you're being forced by the police into basically admitting. And then only later do you realize that you might have had a pathway out if you had proper representation.
This was 1989 when crime in New York City was much more serious than it was. More than twice as many violence, crimes, shootings, etc. Nationwide. The crime peaked nationwide in 1993, 1994, and then did start to come down. So the public panic about crime was at that time well calibrated to the fact that crime was the highest it had ever been, as far as they were keeping statistics on violence in America.
But we still have a justice system. So while fear might be high and crimes might be high, it doesn't mean that you just throw out multiple different allegations and arrest whoever you want. And that was the problem with the justice system, to this day, by the way, still in New York City. And, it wasn't just the media outrage. I mean, there were the political games that were being played at this time, they were being used as a weapon politically in New York politics. And it was an election year, if I recall, and they became the centerpiece of some deeper stuff that was happening in the city at the time.
It's a reminder that the whole, you kind of tried to talk about it just as a race thing. At the time, Linda Fairstein, who was the prosecutor who brought them to justice, she was viewed as a feminist icon and hero for protecting women. And so I think that goes to show you how some of these kinds of aspects of the intersectional hierarchy of wokeness are actually kind of in tension. I mean, black males are overrepresented in people who are accused of sexual crimes and violent crimes on campuses, just in general. And, Me Too, believe all women, but then... I don't know, because also we have to...
That's why we have laws and a justice system, and that's why our justice system should be fair and equitable. But to force these people into being convicted, and before a jury that is feeling the fear in New York City at the time and reading the news, it doesn't have to be about them, but other news, that's how we get into this situation. And, I don't think you just round up whoever you want because they make you feel funny.
They weren't just round up willy-nilly. There were, again, other witnesses in the park on that rampage on that night who identified all 5 of these suspects as being with them throughout the rampage and participating in the bludgeoning of this female jogger. And when Salam took the stand specifically during his trial, he had a lawyer paid for by his mother. He said that he was carrying a 14-inch metal pipe, which was the same type of weapon used to bludgeon both a male school teacher and the female jogger, and also claimed that he believed his DNA would have been left on the jogger's body. During his interrogation by the police, a police officer did a classic tactic where he said, "We are going to be recovering fingerprints from this woman's shirt, and if they come back and they're not your fingerprints, then you'll be free to go. But if they are your fingerprints, you might want to tell us now if you were involved in this." All of a sudden, he says, I was there, but I didn't rape her. I only held her down. There was another individual who testified that they had a hard time getting an erection because of all of the blood and the feces that was coming from her beating. Antron McCrae said, "We charged her, we got her on the ground, everybody started hitting her and stuff. She was on the ground, everybody stopping and everything. I grabbed one arm, some other kid grabbed one arm, and we grabbed her legs and stuff." Another individual who was interrogated said the exact same thing, that they held down her legs and her arms.
We could do this all day long, and these statements were all put before a court of law, and they were stated, they made
and they were convicted.
Under duress, and that's why later they were exonerated. When you put people under duress, and also DNA was flawed at the time, deeply flawed. Witness testimony is the least reliable form of testimony. This was supposedly
they were exonerated
at night.
Because someone else came forward, said they did it, and that person's DNA, and that they did it alone, and that person's DNA was fine. That's why they were exonerated.
Right, because they didn't have DNA of the other individuals, because the DNA evidence at that time was so
weak.
Correct.
So to say that they should have stayed in court and then continued to be convicted after they were exonerated, in which you also have to overcome a burden of proof. You have to poke holes at the story. So if their testimony was already flawed because it was under duress, and all those quotes you just said were not
there was a lot of
accurate.
Exaggeration as to the interrogation tactics of the police, and even in their lawsuit, a lot of the things that were presented in this film by Ava DuVernay were complete exaggerations and falsehoods. They were never denied food. The timeline was completely inaccurate. They didn't bring any of this in their lawsuit against the city. So I think there's just a misunderstanding of exactly what happened here. And how would it be that all 5 of them were interrogated under duress, and yet all 5 of their stories were incredibly consistent and matched all of the evidence at the scene?
That's based on your conclusion. That is not based on the law's
and the conclusion.
Very important.
And the conclusion that the jury reached.
It was correct. I would say it was correct to exonerate them based on DNA evidence being found that did match one other person who said they acted alone. But I don't think...
Right, you can't prove the rape because none of them admitted to raping her, right? They all said that they held her down, they pinned the rape on other people. The only person who should have been convicted of the rape was Reyes. But I contend that they were absolutely involved in this attack.
The bottom line is I don't think it's defamation to have that opinion, as Donald Trump does. So we'll see how that lawsuit fares. I would expect not very well. Coming up next, we have an update on the situation in the Middle East. More Rising right after this. We're increasingly dealing with 2 very stark, different realities, Israel's and the U.S. On one hand, the U.S. keeps talking about things calming down in the Middle East. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken touched down in Israel this morning to pursue a cessation of hostilities, coming mere hours after Iranian-backed Hezbollah lobbed rockets that penetrated the Iron Dome and sent Israeli residents fleeing. Not to be outdone, the Israeli military targeted an area near Rafik Hariri University Hospital. The death toll has risen to 13, with 57 people wounded, according to Lebanon's health ministry. The attack just south of Beirut, which came without warning, also damaged the hospital, the health ministry added. Israel said it was targeting Hezbollah's finance organization, which stashed millions of dollars under that hospital.
Hezbollah also claimed credit for an attack this weekend on Prime Minister Netanyahu's vacation home in the seaside town of Caesarea. Then there were the revelations this weekend emanating from a document which was hacked or leaked that revealed sensitive Pentagon documents that detailed Israeli preparation for an attack on Iran and plans for a potential counterattack. Information, meanwhile, Israel keeps bombing Gaza and including a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Okay, to break this all down and offer an analysis of what is next is rising friend Trita Parsi, of the Quincy Institute. So, Trita, Anthony Blinken is in Israel right now as we speak, and he got off the plane just a few hours ago. Has he addressed the latest escalation, especially the bombing of this hospital and the money that was being stored underneath, which is what the Israeli government states?
Yeah, on that point, first, let me just clarify one thing that, we've heard this from the Israelis for more than a year, that there were Hamas tunnels under this hospital or these things under those other buildings or at the UN offices, and no clear evidence has been presented at any one of those instances, and certainly not in the case of what they're saying about this hospital in Beirut, nor about this financial system, which is actually community banks. It's become easy, just you connect it to Hezbollah or Hamas, and then suddenly everything becomes a legitimate target. And reality, going to your first question, is that the Biden administration has essentially gone along with all of this, including the changing Israeli objectives when it comes to its invasion of Lebanon, that now goes well beyond Resolution 1701, which again, the Biden administration has now shifted its position to adopt the Israeli position, whereas just weeks ago it was talking about implementing 1701 rather than going beyond it. So I think we're seeing a pattern clearly that continues. We shouldn't be surprised by it any longer, which is the Israelis move the goalpost and the Biden administration pliantly adjusts to that.
Yeah, you'd think this would be a opportunity, really, having killed Yahya Sinwar, to say that a major objective of Israel's military actions has been accomplished. U.S. policy has been to support Israel, given what happened on October 7th. But our stated policy from Biden is that we don't want to have a wider war, and that the devastating toll of innocent civilians there is not acceptable. And Kamala Harris doesn't want this as a campaign issue, as an election day issue, because it's killing her with the progressive base and with Arab Americans. So I would think that now would be the time to be a little more strident in our negotiations with Israel. Blinken, you would think, would say, okay, now enough truly is enough, no more. There's no sign that's happening.
No sign whatsoever. And I would just add to it perhaps the most important factor, which is the Biden administration has now decided to put U.S. troops in what essentially is an active war zone, in a war that is the war of another country. So once the Israelis attack, which is very likely to happen before the elections, and the Iranians respond to that, then we will potentially see Americans getting killed, which will then even further drag us into a war that Congress has not authorized, that no one has been able to explain why it is necessary for the U.S. to fight this war based on our own interests. So the degree to which the escalation has happened, if this had happened within weeks after October 7th, there would have been a tremendous amount of noise. But the Biden administration has managed to choreograph this in such a way that the escalation is slow enough in order for people not to react forcefully enough to the fact that we have escalated matters this far, that we've gone so far that we're now actually putting U.S. troops without congressional authorization in an active war zone, dragging us deeper and deeper into a war that we should not be involved in.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on that point, Netanyahu obviously has been ignoring the sort of whispers from the United States, these sort of telegraph statements indicating that they're not super happy with the way things are going. He has ignored them, continuing the assault against Hamas and Hezbollah, killing Yahya Sinwar. I mean, but what incentive would he have to change his behavior? These public statements are clearly not backed up by actions. I mean, with the sending of these 100 troops, which they claim is, don't worry, we're only sending them to operate this air missile system. I don't think anyone's buying that. I mean, what incentive would Netanyahu have to change his behavior? The U.S. Hasn't really given him any reason or consequence to do so.
You're absolutely correct. We have provided him zero incentives to listen to us and plenty of incentives not to listen to us. I mean, the mere fact that we're putting the THAAD system in Israel is essentially that every time Israel and Netanyahu escalates this war against our expressed wishes, what does Biden do? He rushes in to protect Israel from the consequences of its own escalation. And escalation we told them not to do. Yet we rush in to protect them from its consequences, which means that we are reducing the cost for Israel to escalate. By reducing the cost for Israel to escalate, we're actually making it easier for Israel to escalate, despite the fact that we say that we don't want it to escalate. And as a result, we end up in this scenario in which we're putting pressure and deterrence against Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas, the Houthis, etc., for them not to escalate. Yet we're actually making it easier, less costly for the Israelis to escalate. And no surprise, we're in an escalatory cycle, because if you actually want to break the escalatory cycle, you have to put pressure on all parties, particularly the party that so far has been the one that has done most of the escalation, which is the Israelis. I'm old enough to remember just weeks ago being told that once Israel has killed Sinwar, mindful of the fact that it would have at that point have taken out 3 of the top leaders of Hamas, the 3 top masterminds behind October 7th, that would be it. It would be the end of war. Israel would have achieved its objective. That has now happened. And instead, we're seeing more open conversation about the annexation of Gaza and building more settlements there.
It seems as if it's in nobody's interest, the U.S., Iran, who've openly said it's in nobody's interest to escalate this situation. And yet Netanyahu continues to push back, as we know. So the U.S. has issued this letter last week basically saying if you continue to do this and if you don't allow humanitarian aid in, we are going to pursue potential withholding of weapons and maybe other sanctions. And when asked about this in a press conference just yesterday, I believe, the State Department spokesperson, sort of evaded the answer. It does seem like there is tension within the Biden administration with Netanyahu, and there's a pressure point in that the U.S. is supporting Israel, but has a Netanyahu problem. Also, other countries have decided, UK, Canada, have decided to withhold weapons to Israel, perhaps maybe some sort of backdoor conversation between the U.S., Biden, and those countries who don't have as strong of an agreement or allyship with the state of Israel. How much of this is a state of Israel problem or a Netanyahu problem? And how, if you were to imagine some scenario, what would legally the U.S., as an ally of Israel, be able to do under the conditions of Netanyahu's leadership right now, or alternatively somebody else?
So let me first start off by saying that, when it comes to these different issues, what other countries have done in terms of reducing, in some cases stopping arms sales, is because of a very simple reason. The evidence of war crimes are so overwhelming. It is actually surprising that some of them have not cut off all of their arms support so far, because they know very well that once the full scope of the evidence emerges, they will also be held accountable. And for some of the states in Europe, who otherwise tend to put a tremendous amount of premium on international law, this is a very, very sensitive issue. The fact that the administration has sent this letter is also its own admission that it knows very well that the Israelis are violating conditions that have been put forward in American law, particularly when it comes to allowing for humanitarian aid, American humanitarian aid to get through. And the law essentially says if that's the case, they are not eligible for any weapons shipments or military assistance. The fact that the administration is giving them a 30-day notice for this is not something that is stipulated in the law. It conveniently falls after the election, but it's a clear indication the administration itself knows quite well what the Israelis are doing, that it's illegal, that the U.S. itself is not following its own laws, and it should. And I think, again, this is, once we're a couple of months away from how this ends, however it ends, and more evidence starts to emerge of what happened, I think it's going to be devastating when we do the introspection of what we did, what we didn't do, and the lies that we told to allow this to continue.
Trita, Parsi, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's nothing that Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina Khan likes more than micromanaging the business world. She just signed off on a new FTC rule banning digital commerce companies and retail sites from using fake reviews and followers to promote their products. That went into effect on Monday. The rule prohibits fake or false consumer reviews, buying positive or negative reviews, certain reviews written by company insiders, and review suppression. This rule comes at a time when the government is looking to clean up the digital media information ecosystem. While some online have applauded the rule, others are saying it goes too far. Now on X, people wrote, quote, "Does anyone trust the FTC? Are we serious? Why did we need this regulation? The devil works hard, but Lina Khan works harder."
The devil?
I think she's the devil. Doesn't the government have better things to do than try to micromanage what reviews people trust online? Everybody knows to take the reviews with a grain of salt.
It's not just
so
reviews,
stupid.
Though. So for instance, like if you want to be an influencer, or say you want to get a hosting job somewhere else, God forbid, and they were like, well, you need to have 6 million followers. So people have been purchasing bots and purchasing accounts that would, number one, either boost their
crime of
rating.
the century.
Well, I mean, some people
Who
are doing it
cares?
honestly or not. And then,
Who cares?
And then wait, second. So it is reviews, because if you're a small business owner and you don't want that other one down the street to be an operation, your competitor, you can get a bunch of bad reviews on them. That's not fair. And then the third thing is that, let's just use Twitter for this example. When Elon Musk said he was going to purchase Twitter, he said he was going to get rid of the bots. And then he decided not to. Maybe it's because in Silicon Valley, to keep getting money, right, you have to say, we're growing, we're growing, we're growing. And so they keep those bots going. This is a dirty little secret in Silicon Valley, that the users that they announce every quarter are not necessarily indicative.
And if somebody gives you money for it, oh well. Like the reviews appear on a site, so whoever's site it is should decide what the policies are, or how we deal with fake reviews, or how we verify them. It's just, to my mind, has nothing to do with the government. Who cares?
Yeah, I have a hard time getting all up in arms about this. I'm generally actually a Lina Khan apologist too, Robby, as you know.
Yeah, we argue about this all the time.
This is too far for me. I don't care if people are posting fake reviews. As you said, it should be the individual sites who decide how to handle this. Like Amazon has a verified review system where if you purchase the product, your review gets pushed to the top of the pile, and it gets a special little flag on it that says this is a verified review from someone who actually bought the product that they're reviewing. On Yelp, there's apparently a system where you can pay to get bad reviews taken down as a restaurant. So I put a lot less stock into Yelp reviews when I'm looking for a great place to eat than I give Amazon book reviews.
Well, there's also Google reviews, and if you were a small business, and there was a situation that they cited in which there was a doctor who was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on his competitors in giving them bad reviews. I know lawyers who've had this situation in which they're given 1-star ratings, and that can affect your business and your bottom line, because you happen to have a competitor who wants to sabotage your business and your well-being.
But this is speech, right? So the question is it fundamentally any different if your competitor decides to run around the town square shouting that you gave them herpes, or if you put it on a Yelp page, right?
That's a real person. And so people have the right to free speech, but do bots and fake accounts have the right to free speech? No, they're not humans, and they're definitely not corporations.
But speech, the First Amendment is not actually it's a defense of, it's a limitation on the government's right to stop you from consuming this speech. So it's not actually the speech of the bots is something I am entitled to hear that the government can't necessarily restrict, because it's the speech, not the speaker, that is relevant from the First Amendment standpoint. Now, the way to deal with people spreading absolutely, positively false, malicious, like you have herpes or something, actually that's the classic where defamation comes from. Yes, you can be sued for that kind of thing, but is just say, I didn't like this place and I had a bad experience. What's the negative review? I hated that's a totally subjective experience. Sometimes people go to restaurants and have a terrible experience there, and other people think it's great, and that's just your opinion, man, and can't be dealt with on the government Lina Khan's level.
But that's a real person. So if I were to go to your restaurant and I'm your competitor, forget about if I were to go to your restaurant. If I'm your competitor and I said, okay, fine, I'm going to buy a bunch of accounts to give you bad reviews, those people didn't go there, and then also you, as the restaurant, don't even know if there actually is real defamation. Say they said something really detrimental on there. You don't even know who to go after, because you have to go through Google and say, who was this person? And
have these things gotten way more sophisticated or something? Because it seems to me the bot reviews or the fake reviews are pretty easy to spot.
But they can take your
They don't
stars
put a lot of time into it, or if it's actually bot driven, it's usually there's full of typos and errors and things like that.
And
There's AI now too.
And I don't buy the idea that these companies are intentionally increasing the number of bot accounts because they want to get more seed money. I mean, the reality is that that diminishes user experience, right? And so they are going to have a trade-off. If they completely flood the system with bots, then they're going to have a bunch of people who are unhappy with the user experience. And so there's not really a great incentive for them to do that. I mean, you're saying there's a financial incentive. I don't think that outweighs the incentive to actually have a real discussion-based platform.
And the way to address it will be, then the people who give you money will sue you for fraudulent, and that will be fine. Like, this happened with Facebook, by the way, and where it was not, they say it's not intentional, and perhaps it was not intentional. At some point, they misrepresented how many video views they were getting on the platform, and it caused a huge, because there was a massive pivot to video on Facebook that was actually not supported by the underlying data, and they got sued and they paid out because so you can.
So there's already a mechanism in place to prevent people from artificially boosting their numbers in order to get money from people who would invest, because that's fraudulent. So I don't buy that we need an additional firewall essentially from the FTC to manipulate reviews.
I think it's preventative. I think, not every investor will go and sue you. I mean, Twitter's valuation is basically non-existent now, as opposed to 2 years ago when they were valued at being like 5 times what it is today. It does have an impact, but investment is short term. It's quarterly. It's not based on how we feel in 10 years after the bots have and AI, by the way, is way more sophisticated. And Lina Khan mentions this in this report, in this ruling, is that they are concerned about the future of AI, which is going to have much more sophisticated reviews with AI images, and who knows, like maybe they have, like the user accounts have, Wikipedia presences or whatever. I mean, there's so much you can do with AI that is really unregulated.
Maybe the AI-generated stuff will be more accurate than what's currently on Wikipedia. Why not? Coming up next, Liz Cheney is making the rounds trying to sell independent and Republican and I guess libertarian voters on Kamala Harris. That's what Tim Wall said. I have some thoughts. Please stay tuned. The former CEO of Abercrombie & Fitch, Mike Jeffries, and 2 of his business associates were arrested today as part of a sex trafficking investigation. The arrests come after years of sexual misconduct allegations made in civil lawsuits and the media from men who said the former CEO lured them with promises of modeling work and then pressed them into sexual acts. For example, one civil lawsuit filed in New York last year accused Abercrombie of allowing Jeffries to run a sex trafficking organization during his 22 years there. Specifically, it said Jeffries had modeling scouts scouring the internet for victims and that some prospective models became sex trafficking victims. Following the suit and an in-depth report by the BBC, Abercrombie said it hired an outside law firm to conduct an independent investigation. The BBC report included a dozen men who described being at events involving sex acts that were staged by Jeffries and his partner at his home and also at various hotels.
An attorney for Jeffries has said, quote, "We will respond in detail to the allegations after the indictment is unsealed and when appropriate, but plan to do so in the courthouse, not the media." Meanwhile, Brooklyn-based U.S. Attorney Breon Peace and FBI officials are scheduled to hold a press conference later today. Yikes.
It is, it's definitely a yikes. There's been a lot of reporting on this guy Jeffries for many years, a lot of media reports on the culture at Abercrombie. There was that documentary of, it was a very sexualized environment, back in a more less sexualized media in general. Their marketing was, outside the norm. Now that's kind of just the norm anywhere. I will say, and maybe this is going to be a very unpopular take from both of you and from all of the viewers, I do start to roll my eye, like everything is being rounded up to sex trafficking. Like it can be bad. It can be certainly bad business practices and somewhat exploitative, but they're not saying that he didn't like chain people to a radiator and force them to... Well, but that's not, the nature is he promised them, are they underage?
Yeah, that's what they claimed
in the documentary.
No, that's what they stated in this.
Well, if it's underage, then yes, it's sex trafficking, but if it's not underage and it's like you were promised a job or an opportunity and you did something stupid, I don't know that that's sex trafficking.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see what the indictment actually says when it's unsealed, but there is an interesting connection here, which is that Abercrombie & Fitch was purchased by Les Wexner back in 1988, and he was a close friend of Jeffrey Epstein, and it was Wexner who installed Jeffries as the CEO in 1992. So that gets my conspiracy brain going a little bit.
Maybe Epstein, Jeffries, and P. Diddy were all hanging out somewhere. Do we have any evidence of that?
And this is something that they've been, not just these sex trafficking rings, which clearly are rings and organized and communities where this could very likely be the case, especially because Wexner was so problematic.
Right.
But also in Canada, there was a former fashion mogul, Peter Nygaard, who was like the biggest fashion mogul, and he was just convicted in a sex trafficking situation with underage minors. There's, of course, the story of Harrods, Al Fayed in the UK, where now there are almost 250 allegations the BBC has reported just today. This has been going on for years in the UK. This is obviously an industry-related problem. And then we look at the Diddy situation, in which clearly there was some sort of trafficking situation, and we haven't even learned any of the details beside what is put out in the public. I mean, there were the celebrities involved, there were folks recruiting.
Yeah.
Obviously, that happened with Epstein. In this situation, it said that his partner was the person recruiting young folks to come and work with them or travel with them. I gotta tell you, I worked at Abercrombie, and I was 18 years old. It was like all the cool kids were going there. And if you got a job at Abercrombie, you like felt so seen. And if you were the front of the store, you were like considered the prettier ones. And if you're the back of the store, you weren't. And I got put in the back of the store, and it like traumatized me. And then they wanted me to like lift boxes. I was like, I'm an 18-year-old, like I'm 105 pounds. I can't lift boxes. But when I saw the documentary, though, there was a culture there, and I highly recommend people see it. It wasn't just that it was sexualizing young kids. I mean, they were recruiting teenagers.
Okay, but nobody has to work there. Like, you're not a prisoner. And you said underage, but I've just looked at like 5 stories now on these new allegations, and no one is saying underage. They're saying men. And that's a big difference to me, because underage people cannot consent to sex. So yes, that counts as sex trafficking. Absolutely criminal. These may still be criminal matters, but at some point, like, adults have to make their own decisions. And if you did something you regret and you thought that was going to turn into a job or something, like, maybe this is just me. Isn't that on you to any degree?
I actually agree with you. It's unethical, but probably not illegal. Right?
Yeah, and it might be bad. It might be if the board wants to oust the head of the business for doing this,
like
100%.
Making promises to people, or like, I mean,
and that can be a civil issue, for sure.
This is like if a guy tells you that he loves you and he doesn't mean it, and then you sleep with him because you think he's in love with you, or he tells you...
Feminists are going to make that illegal.
Like,
unless
that's unethical.
By them. Why is it bad that Olivia Nuzzi has a relationship after she reports, and yet...
But we're not saying she should go to jail.
Well, yeah, it's unethical and unprofessional, so you should lose your job.
Right.
But should you go to jail if you make false promises in exchange for sex?
They were hiring people that were underage, teenagers, right? And so... I think that's where the allegations of being underage is part of this, right? So in that documentary, you'll see that they were targeting high schoolers. There was a whole operation, how they recruited them online and in person. I mean, I was shocked that, they had this whole ball operation where they would find girls, like young girls and young boys, to come in because they looked good. And, that today I think would be seen very unethical and a sign of something worse. I don't think that the authorities, both in the UK and here, would be putting forth charges of human trafficking unless they had something. We haven't seen the indictment. But again, like, why don't we have the same outrage for this as we do with Diddy? And that's what, we did not know a lot about Diddy a few weeks ago. We barely had anything. And yet now, except for the Cassie video, but that didn't mean that he was trafficking people. Now we have more information.
I mean, even in the Diddy case, I want more information before I just assert that everything is sex trafficking. Again, it could be exploitative and criminal, and there's a lot more detail in that. And again, if it's underage people, then yes, Justin Bieber, underage. Right. Usher, underage at the time. So yes, I have no dispute. And if in this case, people who are underage of the consent were being taken advantage of sexually, then yes, that certainly can be a criminal matter. I'm not actually seeing that alleged specifically in this new reporting about why they arrested him. So I have a little bit of like, is it just the word it's always trafficking now. I initially thought that was something we reserved for like, Filipino women smuggled into the country and have to serve as sex workers, or they get beaten or something. Like
sex trafficking. Human sex trafficking.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just now. I mean, Epstein was tried for this, 20 years ago.
Yeah, but again, that was underage girls.
Underage girls, exactly. And the Lolita Express.
Yeah.
And how many people were in that Lolita Express, let's just remind folks, that have gotten away scot-free?
Yeah. I went to the mall over the weekend in the Pentagon City Mall.
Oh, yeah?
And there was, I thought there was what was the other one? Hollister? It had a
it was
similar
related
branding.
to it, yeah.
And I'm like on the 3rd floor, so I was on the 1st floor, and I'm looking up. I was hoping it was a Hollister. Went up there, it was not, but it was actually a Dungeons & Dragons specialty store. So
Well,
I was
perfect for
perfectly
you.
Perfect for me. I was very happy there.
Not a similar look by any means.
No, for a totally different cast of young people, the geeks and the jocks. All right, we have more rising coming up. Is Liz Cheney really helping Kamala Harris during this vast media tour she's engaged in? We'll debate that. Stay tuned. Former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney was campaigning all over town yesterday, part of Vice President Kamala Harris's, some would say, delusional plan to attract Republican voters. Cheney tagged along with Harris to 3 battleground states, including Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Here's a glimpse.
And so I think that we are facing a choice in this election. It's not about party. It's about right and wrong. And I certainly have many Republicans who will say to me, I can't be public. They do worry about a whole range of things, including violence, but they'll do the right thing. And I would just remind people, if you're at all concerned, you can vote your conscience and not ever have to say a word to anybody. And there will be millions of Republicans who do that on November 5th, vote for Vice President Harris.
Many Democrats seem convinced that this is a great move. MSNBC's Chris Matthews is even calling Cheney a heroic figure. Let's watch.
Well, Mika, I wouldn't think a few years ago I would ever be singing the praises of a Cheney member of the family, a member of that family. I really did not like the Iraq War, and I didn't like the neocons, and Cheney was leading them all, and he took us into that war, and it killed almost 200,000 people in Iraq, and it served no purpose. They had a bunker, a barrier against Iran, and they got rid of it. Anyway, she is a character almost out of the movies, out of A Man for All Seasons. I've never seen a more heroic figure than Liz Cheney. She lost her state probably forever. She lost her party. She lost her leadership in the Republican House. She could have been on her way to Speaker. It was very probable. She gave it all away in the interest of truth. That's what she stood for. It's amazing to me how few people have gotten behind her. But now, one person that's got behind her is Kamala Harris. And those sitting together, those 2 women, as you say, on that stage is remarkable because there's such courage there from Liz Cheney. And I cannot say anything that would stop me from saying she's been unbelievable.
Now take a listen to Jon Stewart calling out Harris's running mate, Governor Tim Walz, on their campaign strategy.
The Cheney thing, do we really have to do that?
Look, it goes broader than that. Look, Bernie Sanders, Dick Cheney, Taylor Swift.
No.
That one. The shooting?
No.
Having the Cheneys on board?
Nah. You can't Dick Cheney or Taylor Swift. No.
We're a big tent.
What country did Taylor Swift get us to invade? No.
Yeah. No, don't you think, though, that, and I do this, I believe this, there is still a core group of folks out there, your point being, and not joke, the don't tread on me, the Reagan piece of this, the libertarian piece, but the constitutional piece, there are a lot of people out there. I think Liz Cheney and Dick Cheney give permission to those folks who want to find a reason to do the right thing.
This libertarian is not interested in the Cheneys instructing us, of all people, on who to vote for. Reacting online, Twitter personality Steve Hilton wrote, quote, "Is there a single person in America who will be persuaded to vote Democrat by Liz Cheney? This Kamala Harris campaign has completely lost the plot." And Glenn Greenwald wrote, quote, "In the closing weeks, Kamala is campaigning with Liz Cheney more than with Tim Walz, as if Liz is her real running mate. Very easy to imagine, if Kamala wins, Liz occupying a key cabinet spot, such as Secretary of Defense, like her dad did twice, would fit in perfectly." So, as Jon Stewart pointed out, and as Chris Matthews pointed out, and I always did respect Chris Matthews for his foreign policy. He was stridently critical of neoconservatives, and he outlines the entire case against her and then throws a hero award at her for what her antics are now. In terms of persuading, I think Tim Walz is completely wrong. That is the exact group of voters who, I don't know if they're open to voting for Kamala Harris, but they're certainly not going to be open to voting for Kamala Harris because the Cheneys tell them to. It's the opposite of that.
Hear me out on this. And I am a Bernie Sanders person, and I'm like, wow, we got these neocons in a tent with Bernie Sanders, which means whatever the last thing they're holding on to, which is like the national security state, and obviously they can't.
Because that's all they care about.
That's all they care about, right? But, okay, fine. What's interesting about this tactic, and we're already seeing it in Pennsylvania, Harris is up by 12, she's got 12% GOP voters in Pennsylvania right now. That is the poll that came out last week. That's huge. If you look at the voters, older voters, those over 50 years old and 80 plus, she's winning for the first time since 2000 with older voters. And older voters from 50 to 80 plus are R plus 13 voters. That's crazy to me. So it's working. This is the most reliable group of voters, older voters. I mean, I have family members in Arizona. I've talked about this before. I've never agreed with them on anything. Our Thanksgiving dinners are always, you're a communist and they're the gun holders. But there is one thing that they agree on, that they don't trust Donald Trump. And some of them voted in 2016 and then didn't vote for Biden. A couple voted for Biden, but they just didn't feel ready to vote for Kamala Harris because it was a rushed timeline. I'm not saying that they all have completely been convinced, but they're definitely asking a lot more questions and moving in favor of Kamala Harris, and I think that this is helping.
I feel like she's looming behind me on screen right
Horrifying.
now. What do you think, Amber?
I'm not sure I buy this electoral strategy as one that is very logical. I mean, the problem with Kamala Harris's campaign is that she has not shorn up support among the Democratic base in a way that she really needs to win an election. She's losing black men, she's losing Latino voters, and Republicans have made great strides to close the gap in voter registration. They closed the registration gap in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, pretty significantly since 2020. So you're contending against more voters as a Democrat, and you're losing members of your own base. Is it really wise to be focusing on a small, never-Trump contingent of the Republican Party?
It's not small at all. So think about it this way. Donald Trump's coalition from 2016 has only been shrinking. And much of that coalition has died. They've died of COVID. They've aged out because he had older voters. In 2020, it shrunk even more. Then January 6th happened, and then more Republicans were disgusted, frankly, by Donald Trump. Now, some of those Republicans might be sitting on the couch right now, which is what Kamala Harris is trying to do, get them off the couch, a percentage. But she also has millennials, the majority of millennials still, especially millennial women, and Gen Zers. She's up by 20 points right now with young people, and she's leading with older voters. So has she lost a couple points with African-American voters? That's based on 2020, but not based on 2016 numbers. And she's pretty much right where she was, right where the Democrats were with Latinos a few years ago. Yes, there's a white male problem, especially with younger white men.
But the election is going to be, it is widely expected to be, we won't know until it's over.
Right.
It is predicted that it will be closer than it was last time. I agree with you that, so Donald Trump is making some strides with particularly male, black, Latino, etc. He's not necessarily increasing his share of the reliable white voter totals. And I think the difficulty and the problem for the Trump people is it going to be, if it wasn't enough last time, is it going to be enough this time? But the problem for the Democrats is they are so much less popular. Trump is actually more popular than he was last time. Democrats are less popular. Biden was so unpopular. Yeah. Harris has improved on Biden, but she's not improved on to where Biden was last time.
Trump. She's more popular than Trump. And the difference between Republican popularity and Democratic popularity and how you feel right now versus the actual popularity of Trump versus Kamala, and she's more popular right now.
The other thing that is happening, though, is that the Trump campaign is employing a different strategy than they did in 2020. So the coalition is going to look different. They are not intentionally trying to win those black men and Latino men. That's sort of a byproduct of their campaign.
They are.
The bulk of
he was in a barbershop
can I finish?
In a black community. Well, I'm just
right.
Conversation.
I know. I mean, I understand that they are doing events geared towards that, but when it comes to whipping out the vote, the bulk of their ground game is actually focused on low to mid propensity voters of all races.
That's a horrible strategy. As somebody who's worked in politics and organized.
For Trump, it's not, though, because Trump is a very different politician. He did extraordinarily well in both 2016 and 2020 with people who had either never voted before or had been delinquent for multiple elections. And there are a lot of people who voted for Trump in 2016 and didn't vote for him in 2020 that they're trying to win back and bring back into the fold. So from that perspective, like, you have to say that losing the Democratic base is a problem when you look at...
She's not losing the Democratic base. So that's really important. She's still winning with the black vote. She's still winning with Latinos. She's still winning by far with young people.
Right, but the Democrats rely on a certain percentage of support among those voters, and if Trump is eating into that, even just a few percentage points, that could be very significant.
Because the national popular vote doesn't matter, right?
Exactly.
It matters where these voters are concentrated. If they're in Michigan and Pennsylvania, and he's picking up, maybe the people who voted for him in 2016 and didn't show up in 2020 for whatever reason.
And registering hundreds of thousands of new voters in each swing state.
Yes, the Pennsylvania registration numbers are looking very bad.
The Republicans have out-registered Democrats in both Arizona and Pennsylvania.
But that's also because more Democrats were already registered there. So
and that's the point. So you're now running against a bigger coalition on the other side.
It's not actually a bigger coalition, though. So, yes, I hear you on that, but you never lead. So we are also registering people. Democrats are also registering people. They're also going after low propensity voters. I mentioned in a different segment that I was getting phone calls in Arizona where I haven't voted in 20 years because they're going through the rolls right now trying to think, well, this person's registered a Democrat, hasn't voted in a long time. Everybody does that. But if that's your only strategy,
it's not the only
and that's
strategy.
Why, Republicans,
it's a big part of it.
A lot of Republicans that are Trump supporting are sounding the alarm on his strategy right now, which is always expand your base. And he's not. And he's doubling down on hurtful and hateful rhetoric. I mean, yesterday he came out and said that he wanted to take news stations off air for disagreeing with him and not giving them their license to stay on air. I mean, the FCC license. He said he was going to go after journalists before. He said he was going to go after his enemies and use the military against them. I mean, this is not normal rhetoric, and it's pushing away voters that he needs. He needs those voters. So aside from being crazy, in my opinion, and authoritarian, the guy, and not to mention the polls that are showing right now, the last 5 are Republican from last week that everybody's citing in those cumulative polls. So it's concerning that we don't really understand these numbers in a deeper way.
Well, if I got a call from Liz Cheney and I was told, here's who you should vote for, I would probably just do the opposite. And up until 5 seconds ago, all Democrats agreed with me on that. That is interesting. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere that you listen to podcasts. See you later.